Hello, stellar people, and welcome to part 3 of a 3-part tutorial, where today we will be doing this lovely illustration of Beautiful Bee's Kiss, but fully developed. So, this is the image on watercolor paper, boarded up before a washdown, and this is after a washdown. You can see the lines are slightly faded and it's pushed back a little bit. So once it's mounted and it's ready, I go in with the pink layer. It's my very first layer, just to define where the character is. Right? This is my blocking in phase. Everything that I want visible and shown, I usually put in light as my first pass, just so I have an idea where I am going. Right, so we have the pink, and now we put on our flesh tone, and now we're doing this light magenta for the darks. And this is my basic plan of what I'm going to go for, and how I'm going to push this painting to its full, complete render. That is my first pass. And now we're going for the background, which is going to be wet into wet, a lot of wet into wet for the clouds. So I'm using a very generous amount of water. Basic blue, sky blue, cerulean. I think it's almost all my blues, but just very pale. Now lifting up some of the edges to soften up the clouds and give it a little bit of variation. And now we're starting our first darks. So everything that was, well, not everything, but the things that I had planned in magenta as dark, I'm going now over with this blue. And again, this is the blocking phase. So now that my darks are on, let's give some volume and some contrast to her hair. So I've got individual strands. I'm breaking up the hair. And here I'm putting in the dark shadows to break it up even more and give you an idea of light and volume and individual hair strands and the motion. Now giving some definition to her skin. The first phase, the first round, the first layers are kind of experimental. I go in loose and light and just try to keep moving. Sometimes things work, sometimes things don't work, but overall, I try to plan out in my first phase. And we try to get everything that we want done, just so we can see it. And any changes, we can do that in later phases. But in the first phase, we're just planning. Now, once I'm done with the initial block-in phase, I then give it a good wash. And washing is when I take a large flat brush and then wipe it down with a lot of water. And what that does is essentially you're stripping the top layer of watercolor off. So then you can go in with more layers, the start of phase 2, which is me then reapplying the paint to give it a nice refreshed feel. So I'm now going over the sky blue and trying to refine it. And I think this is a great way to not get muddied colors, to keep it nice and vibrant and crisp so that it doesn't look overworked or muddy, and it's just part of my process. So now I'm working on the sky, trying to get, I want the transition of a darker blue fading down to the clouds, a lot of wet into wet. And I want the white light clouds, the poofy clouds on the bottom, and the blue sky transitioning down to the clouds. And once I'm sort of satisfied with that, I move on back to the character, where I reapply my colors. So the flesh tones, I'm reintroducing those back in. And usually for my second phase, I do a slightly more concentrated colors, because I'm going to wipe it down one more time. But for this phase, I can go for a little bit darker, a little bit more concentration of watercolor. Now I'm doing some shadow effects for her clothing. Some wet into wet for her wings. And wet into wet gives it that softness. Now we're going back in for the darkness of her stripes and her hair, which I've made it of a deeper red, a reddish orange with a little bit of brown in it. And I'm a little bit in phase 2, quicker and looser, while trying to have an idea of what the finished product will look like. So sometimes I'm heavy-handed, but you can do this in this layer, in the phase 2. Now we're bringing those darks back in for her clothing, her undergarment. Now this is the start of some detailing. And I usually start detailing in the second phase, just to punch up the character a bit and make it much more defined. So there's this, I got my tiny brush out, and I'm just noodling. So I'm putting some shadows and some darks on her clothing to punch that up a bit. Putting her dark stripes on. For her stripes, I did a brown underneath, and now I'm going over that with blue. Now I really want to go for the clouds on this layer, right? Because in phase 3, we're going to go very light into the clouds. So I want to go as heavy as I can, or as heavy as I dare on this in phase 2. I'm using a napkin to blot up the watercolor to soften it. And now I'm really going in with some dark blues. And we transition those blues downward. But I go pretty heavy on this phase. Some touch-ups. And this is phase 2. It looks a little bit rough, and so I wash it down. And this is the final and last phase, right, to the completed piece. So we're going back in with the background, and since we want this to be the lightest, we're going in very light. So a lot of wet into wet. We have the basic structure of the clouds, and now we just want to touch this up. So I have this really light, I did it wet into wet, and now this very light blue. Just to give an area of where I want this darker blue to go. I have to mix it well because there's a lot of blues. I think it's all my blues. And we add that to the wet and wet. And the dark blues will diffuse into and mix with the lighter blue. So you get this softness of color. But I want the transition from dark blues to go diagonally from upper right to bottom left. Now some wet into wet for the shadow of her dress. In the third phase, this final phase, I usually introduce the colors softer and lighter than previous. Well, especially for phase 2. Because we want, in phase 2, you can feel the colors into the phase 3. But we don't want to emphasize some things as much as we did in the previous phases. We want some softness, some higher contrast. And that's what we do in this phase. So it's a lot of detailing, a lot of softening. I try to be much more controlled with phase 3. Very small brush work. So I'm adding definition and pulling her right arm forward. As you notice, I put a lot of focus on the eyes because that is a very important part of character work. So I try to have as much contrast and definition in her eyes as possible. Dark blue is one of the final phases because blue is very, very noticeable in the wrong areas. But now I'm using it for touch-ups to get those last bit of dark areas. Now I think you can tell that in phase 3, the detail work is a slower, more methodical process. Little tiny details, and like I'm doing the tattering of her dress. While in the previous phases, phase 1 and 2, it was faster, more broad strokes. It was a rip-roaring, fun, good time. But it's now time to finish up the small little bits. And oh, would you look at that? I think she's done. Oh, she's beautiful. She's but yeah, she looks good. I think we're done. Good job, us. Good job. Now this was the previous version in tutorial number 2, the very, very basics of watercolor. One layer, multiple layers on top of each other. The transitions, layering. Is much more simple than this one, which is a lot of layers, some wash downs, reintroducing colors of various shades. All in all, this illustration is just more colorful. And finally, to conclude my painting process, I cut it from the mounted board and I shout, "Huzzah!" And I take a photo, and that concludes the painting. But in all seriousness, this is just about what I had in mind for this painting. The clouds are deep but soft. We've got the light foofy clouds on the bottom. She's in motion. She's got the hair movement, cloth movement. She's coming at you. I like this one. But of course, I am very, very biased. So, I hope you enjoyed this illustration of Beautiful Bee's Kiss. This concludes tutorial number 3. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I had painting it, and I will see you on the next video. So remember, thank you for watching this, and keep shining.